She gets it just as you're gonna go up there.
Right.
I'm John. There's Amanda. Curtis was supposed to be here, but she's going to improvise without him. So we are doing weapons of the Civil War. Now, there were more weapons than most people would have thought. Most people just imagine muskets and cannons, but there's actually a lot more. One of the most popular weapons for both officers in the military and civilians was the Smith & Wesson revolver. The way the Smith & Wesson revolver works, you all know what it looks like. It had 6 cylinders. It rotated when the trigger was pulled, and then the hander came down. It would shoot the shot. Now, the main difference between the revolver back then and the revolvers nowadays is that when you pull the trigger nowadays, it would repeat, which means the hammer would come back on its own. Back then, you had to pull the hammer back on your own with your thumb. So when you see in movies, like when they're the officers are shooting, they're always pulling it back with their thumb. They're sliding it back with their hands in old westerns. Another gun from that era was the lever-action rifle. This was pretty new for that era, which is one of the main reasons why it wasn't used in actual military. The way this weapon worked, kind of like a shotgun, you'd slide the bullets into a tube with a spring, and when you cock the lever back, it would slide the bullet into a chamber, and when you put it back forward, it would lock in. You pull the trigger, primer hits the flint, and the bullet goes on its way. This weapon was kind of hard to maintain too back then, since it was relatively new. You had to actually take this weapon apart because it had a lot more moving parts than they were used to back then. You had the trigger mechanism, which was all new. You actually couldn't be able to take that out in the field because it's a very delicate part of the weapon. Another new addition back then was the double barrel shotgun. Double barrel shotgun works actually quite similar to a cannon back then with the addition of shells. I'm sure many of you have seen it. You click the action, you break it apart, the shells eject, you put them back, new shells in, you click it closed, you pull the trigger and they're on their way. A little repetitive here. Back then, one of the main differences between now and then, back then, the shells were made of paper since they didn't know how to make plastic in mass quantities. So a big thing back then was they're actually pretty easy to catch fire, so you had shells in your pocket and they catch fire. That's kind of dangerous for back then. This gun was pretty easy to maintain. Really all you needed to do was keep the barrel clean, and you could just usually use that by running things down the barrel. Another weapon was a bolt action rifle. Now these are still used today, mostly hunting. Just it's a bolt, you pull it back, forward, in, closed. This was mainly used for sharpshooters back in the Civil War, but the difference was you could only chamber a single bullet at a time. They didn't have magazines. Sharpshooters would usually be away from the battlefield. They didn't have scopes back then, so what they did was they put iron sights. It was a kind of a triangle on the tip of the gun. You'd flip it up, you'd have a little bar for your zeroing distance, and they try to calculate the distance from the shot by then, and since they could only chamber one round at a time, they had to load it in manually. This gun was one of the more hard ones to maintain back then, considering that once again you had to take it apart, and the bolt came out separate from the actual action. So this was harder to maintain. Another weapon, this was actually rare back then, but it was around, was the Gatling gun. It's the closest thing you can consider it to today was the minigun, but back then you had to crank it. Very hard to use, very rare. It was real heavy back then, so it didn't see much use in the battlefield, and it was very inaccurate back then, very unreliable because it had to be magazine fed, but it had to be upside down so they didn't have springs, so it was very easy to jam. Very unreliable gun, very, very hard to maintain, so it really didn't see a lot of action back then. This is one of the mainly seen ones on the battlefield, was a cannon. Cannon, very simple gun. You used, it would be manned by a 5-man crew, 2 to reload, 3 to aim, and an officer to get the coordinates in. The gunpowder would come in a pack. They put the pack in the barrel, stuff it down there, then put the cannonball in there. Then they light the fuse, and ball would go on its way. And The way it was used, they didn't actually aim directly at the enemy. They'd aim at the ground and try to bounce the shot for maximum damage. So, yeah. My last weapon, and this was by far the most commonly seen, was just a classic musket. This is obviously a classic, not much change for the musket, works very similar to the cannon. They take a pack of gunpowder, put it in the barrel, use a ramrod to stuff it down there along with a bullet right in after it, pull the trigger, and it goes. This gun required also a lot of maintenance because black powder builds up residue real easy. So it needed to be clean. It was also very inaccurate.
We're doing the history of certain guns. So the Smith & Wesson was created by Horace Smith and Daniel Weston, and they were created in like 1852 to make a fully self-contained cartridge. From the beginning, Smith & Wesson firearms were noted for their innovation design, high-quality products, and reliability. The accomplishments of Smith & Wesson were numerous contributions on the history of firearms. Smith & Wesson was an industrial leader in 1852, and a lot of these guns were used more often than certain other ones, like this one. The Colt Army revolver. So it was made in 1860, and it was manufactured through 1873. The total production consisted of more than 200,000 guns, and it was a 6-shot 44 caliber revolver, and it was a primary handgun used from the Union troops. And the Civil War musket, it was the second most widely used weapon in the Civil War, and it was mostly used through Confederates. And it was a 3-band single-shot muzzle-loading rifle musket, and it was a standard weapon in the British Army between 1850 and 1867.
So another big change that came with the Civil War was new kind of ammo. They couldn't just rely on a simple metal pellet anymore with a pack of powder. The main difference was, like I said, was the lever action was with a cartridge. The bullet cartridge actually had the gunpowder built in with it. What it was a bronze cylinder. The gunpowder would go in with it, and the bullet would go in on top of it with a piece of flint at the back. So when you pulled the trigger, the piece of flint would get struck and it would spark. Inside the cartridge there would be a small explosion which sent the bullet shooting down the barrel of the gun and out the barrel. This was a big change. It was much easier. You could fire a lot more rounds downrange a lot faster since you didn't have to waste time loading, actually packing the powder in with the bullet. It also improved the range due to the shape of the new round, much more aerodynamic, and it was much more accurate. Yeah. This is the classic bullet, just literally a ball, packing the powder with it, very inaccurate. As soon as it left the barrel, it actually started wobbling in the air, making what you were actually aiming at much harder to hit. That's it.